All right, get ready because today we're diving deep into a world that's both familiar and a little bit wild. Primate sexuality. I was super intrigued by those book excerpts you sent over.
Oh, it's a fascinating read. This book takes us through the whole evolution of sexual behavior, all across the primate family tree,
Hmm.
from, ancient monkeys all the way to us.
Yeah, and it turns out our primate relatives have some pretty uh interesting ways of doing things when it comes to mating. I mean, some are monogamous, some have those harems, some are, well, things get a little complicated.
Absolutely. The book does a great job of highlighting that diversity. It explores those evolutionary pressures that have shaped all these different approaches. And it starts with a really intriguing question. Why are some primates monogamous when it's so rare in mammals?
Yeah, exactly. It seems like in the primate world, you'd think it would be all about, spreading those genes as far as possible. But then you have these New World monkeys, and a lot of them are all about those long-term relationships.
Right. It really makes you think, huh? And what's interesting is that the book connects this monogamy to the environment these monkeys live in. Like, take the titi monkeys.
Okay, those are some of the ones that really stood out.
They live in dense forests where food and resources are scattered. It basically takes two parents to raise their young successfully. So the males are super involved in parental care, carrying infants, finding food, all that.
So it's not just about like lovey-dovey stuff, it's a practical adaptation to their environments.
Precisely. Monogamy, in their case, means the offspring are more likely to survive. And that, from an evolutionary perspective, is the whole point.
Makes you wonder if early humans might have faced similar situations, right? Okay, but we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. The book also goes into old world monkeys, and their mating systems are a whole other story.
Oh yeah, it's a very different story. Unlike those monogamous New World monkeys, Old World monkeys are generally not monogamous, and they've got these complex social structures, all driven by something called mate dispersal.
Okay, break that down for me. What's mate dispersal, and why is it so important?
Well, essentially, it's a system that evolved to stop, inbreeding. In most Old World monkeys, either the males or females will leave their birth group when they reach sexual maturity. And this makes sure there's genetic diversity, which is really important to avoid the problems of inbreeding.
Makes sense. You don't want offspring who can't survive.
Exactly. And the book goes into this, explaining how inbreeding can lead to all kinds of problems, like reduced fertility and being more susceptible to diseases. It's amazing how evolution has shaped these behaviors to make sure the species stays healthy in the long run.
So in old world monkeys, it's usually the males leaving their birth groups, which means there's some pretty intense competition for mates, right? There were some pretty wild examples in the book.
There were. Those baboons, for instance, the dominant males, get most of the mating opportunities, while others have to try different tactics. Some try to befriend females, offering support and protection, and hoping for, some mating opportunities in return.
Haha. So not quite simping, as the book called it, but definitely a strategic way to try and get ahead.
Exactly. It shows that even in these, seemingly rigid social structures, there's room for individual strategies and approaches.
And what about those massive groups of mandrills? The book talked about those too. The competition there must be insane.
Oh, it is. Imagine hundreds of individuals all competing for the attention of just a few receptive females. The book describes how only a tiny percentage of males actually get to mate during each breeding season.
Tough odds. And then there are the geladas. With those dominant males in charge of their harems, it was like a primate soap opera.
It really was. And it shows how important physical strength and social smarts are for those males.
But hold on, it's not just the males in control here, is it? The book talked about females competing as well.
Oh, absolutely. That's important to remember. They aren't just passive. They have their own strategies for reproductive success, including competing for the most desirable males.
So both males and females are making choices and competing.
For sure. And this dynamic plays out differently in each species. In fact, the book even mentioned one case where the females are actually in charge. The macaques.
Ah, those were the ones with those female-led societies, right? Where the males have to prove they're worthy of joining the group?
That's the one. These macaque societies really challenge those traditional views of male dominance in primate groups. The females have strong social bonds, and they control access to resources, even mating opportunities.
So they've kind of flipped the script on those old world monkeys, where the males are usually dominant.
You could say that. It just goes to show how many different social structures have evolved among primates. Really makes you think about what drives those differences, doesn't it?
It does. But before we go too deep into that, I think it's time to move on to the apes. in our primate adventure.
Oh yeah, that's where things get even more interesting. Our closest primate relatives, they bring their own unique twists to the story of mating and reproduction.
All right, I'm ready for our ape cousins. But for that, you'll have to join us for part 2 of our primate sexuality deep dive.
Welcome back to our primate sexuality deep dive. Last time we were exploring all those different mating systems in monkeys, from the monogamous pairs in the New World to all those complicated social structures in the Old World. But now it's time to meet our closest relatives, the apes.
All right, I'm ready to dive into the ape world. I remember the book mentioned their mating strategies get even more interesting, and honestly, after those old world monkeys, I'm not sure how that's even possible.
Well, let's start with a bit of a surprise. Remember how we talked about monogamy being rare in primates? Well, one of our ape cousins, the gibbon, really goes completely against that.
Wait, really? Monogamous apes? I thought it was all competition and harems with apes.
Yeah, that's a common thought. Gibbons, even though they are apes, are actually our most distant ape relatives. They branched off from the other apes something like 17 million years ago. And what's really remarkable is that they've developed this monogamous mating system, kind of like those New World monkeys we talked about.
So are these gibbons like the ultimate romantics of the ape world then? Serenading each other in the trees?
Not exactly. The book describes them as pretty solitary creatures living in those dense forests. They actually find mates by calling out to each other across long distances. It's like, imagine a primate version of a long-distance relationship, I guess.
Uh-huh. Okay, so no candlelit dinners then.
Right.
But I remember the book said they have incredibly low rates of cheating and breaking up, even lower than us.
That's right. Once a pair bonds, they tend to stay together for life. And the book suggests this monogamy is tied to their solitary lifestyle and the challenges of raising offspring in that kind of environment.
Okay, I see the connection to those New World monkeys now. It's about adapting to where they live. But wouldn't a more diverse gene pool be better for them?
That's a good question. It really shows the trade-offs of any mating system. Monogamy might limit how much genes get mixed, but it also provides stability, make sure both parents are investing in raising the kids. And for the gibbons, with their limited resources and slow reproduction, this seems to be the best strategy for them.
So, monogamy, even with its downsides, has its advantages in certain environments. Makes you wonder how those early humans figured all this out. But let's move on to some other apes who maybe aren't so traditional in their approach to love, shall we say.
Right, let's talk about orangutans. Remember how I said things could get complicated? Well, orangutans definitely take that to a whole new level.
Yeah, the book hinted at some, let's say, darker parts of their mating behavior. Something about, was it quasi-polygyny? And a lot of, well, forced encounters. Didn't sound very nice.
It's definitely not a romantic comedy. Orangutans are solitary, and their mating system is all about intense competition and, yeah, unfortunately, a lot of sexual coercion.
Okay, hold on. Let's back up a bit. What exactly is quasi-polygyny?
It's basically a system where males try to mate with as many females as they can. But unlike, say, gorillas who form harems, they don't have permanent groups. Instead, male orangutans roam around a large territory, trying to mate with any female they find.
And the females are okay with this.
Well, it's not that simple. Female orangutans do have preferences, and they're especially drawn to males with those big cheek pads, the flanges.
Flanges, right. Those big fleshy things on their faces. The book mentioned them being attractive to females, but I didn't really get why.
Well, the book suggests those flanges are a sign of maturity and strength. It's like they're advertising their good genes. And these flange males have special calls that can attract females from far away.
So those are the rock stars of the orangutan world. But what about those males who don't have flanges?
Those unflanged males, they have a much harder time. And this is where things get a little darker. See, female orangutans have concealed ovulation. That means there's no outward sign to show when they're fertile.
Oh, right. The book mentioned that. I didn't quite get why it was so important, though.
Well, because females don't show when they're fertile, the males can't just wait for the right time. They try to mate as often as possible, even if the female isn't receptive. And that, sadly, leads to a lot of forced copulations.
So the females have no say in it at all.
They do have some ways to try and reduce the risks, and the book goes into that. For example, they can be infertile for a long time after giving birth, and they nurse their young for a long time too. This makes it less likely that males will kill the infants, which is a risk in some primates.
It's a pretty stark reminder that nature can be pretty harsh. It seems like a tough system for the females to deal with.
It's definitely a complex system, And the book doesn't shy away from those difficult aspects. But it's important to remember that we're looking at this from our own human perspective. For orangutans, this is how they've evolved over millions of years, and it's all about trying to reproduce and pass on their genes.
Okay, so we've got these monogamous gibbons and the orangutans with their, let's say, complicated system. What about gorillas? Where do they fit in all of this?
Gorillas are interesting because they're actually even closer to us genetically than orangutans.
Right.
We share almost 98% of our DNA with them. And their mating system is different from both gibbons and orangutans. They practice a more classic form of polygyny, with harems led by a dominant silverback male.
Oh, okay. Now we're talking. I can picture those classic nature documentaries with the silverback pounding his chest and protecting his family.
You're not far off. The book describes the typical gorilla group as one silverback male, several females, and maybe a son or two that he tolerates. And the males are much bigger than the females. It's called sexual dimorphism, and it's a direct result of all that competition for mates.
So is it back to that bigger is better idea we saw in some of those old world monkeys?
Kind of, yeah. That silverback needs to be strong to fight off rivals and protect his harem.
What about the females, though? What are they doing? Just waiting around for the silverback's attention?
Not at all. The book says gorillas are actually in this interesting transition phase between being what's called matrilocal and patrilocal.
Sorry, remind me what those are again?
No problem. Matrilocal means the females stay with their families and the males leave. Patrilocal is the opposite. Males stay and the females leave.
Right, got it. So where do gorillas fit in?
They're kind of in between. Female gorillas leave their birth families, but they don't form those strong bonds with the other females in the silverback's harem like you see in some primates. Their main relationship is with the silverback himself.
Interesting. So it's all about keeping the silverback happy.
To a certain extent, yeah. The females compete for his attention. There's even a social hierarchy within the harem. And the book mentioned that they'll even try to have sex with him when they're pregnant, seemingly to strengthen their bond with him.
Wow, that's some next level strategizing. It seems like gorilla sex is less about pleasure and more about social dynamics and power.
That's a good point. And it shows how different mating systems can really shape their behavior. It makes you think about how much of our own behavior is from biology and how much is from culture, doesn't it?
It really does. But I think we're getting close to the end of part 2 here. We've covered a lot, from those monogamous gibbons to those more complex systems in orangutans and gorillas.
And in part 3, we'll wrap up our primate journey with some final thoughts and that thought-provoking question I mentioned.
Definitely stick around for that. We're about to bring it all home and maybe even learn a little something about ourselves along the way. Well, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into primate sexuality. I gotta say, after learning about all these different mating systems, from those, committed gibbons to those, well, let's say assertive orangutans, my brain is kind of full.
It really is a lot to take in, isn't it? I mean, this book has taken us on a wild journey through the primate world, showing us just how diverse their sexual behavior can be.
It is pretty mind-blowing to see how evolution has shaped all these different behaviors, depending on the environment and the social pressures. And it really gets you thinking, like, how much of our own behavior, even in relationships, might be influenced by our primate ancestors.
Right. That's the big question, isn't it? Are we humans really that different from our primate cousins? Or are we still kind of playing out these ancient evolutionary patterns? No, deep down.
Exactly. Like, are we programmed for monogamy like those gibbons? Or are we more wired for competition and having multiple partners like some of those old world monkeys? I mean, it makes you wonder.
Well, the book doesn't give us any easy answers, and honestly, I think that's part of what makes it so interesting. It presents this whole spectrum of primate sexuality, from those super strong pair bonds to those, let's say, more flexible arrangements.
It definitely shows that there's no single explanation for why primates, us included, do what we do when it comes to sex and relationships.
For sure. It's a complex mix of biology, environment, and social dynamics. And to really understand ourselves, we have to look at all of those things.
Okay, so where does all this leave us? What's the big takeaway from all of this primate pondering?
Well, I think the book and our conversation have led us to this final thought-provoking question. Considering what we now know about the variety, and sometimes even the surprising mating systems of our primate relatives, how much are those ancient evolutionary pressures still influencing human behavior today?
Whoa, that's a big one to end on. Like, even with all our fancy human societies and cultures, are we still driven by those primal urges that shaped our ancestors millions of years ago?
Definitely something to think about. And hey, Maybe even a topic for another deep dive sometime.
I'd say so. But for now, I think we've reached the end of our primate exploration. Thanks for joining us on this wild ride through the world of monkey and ape mating. It's been, well, let's just say it's been educational.
And until next time.